All right, it looks to me like the slope on the number of participants joining is starting to level off, so we can go ahead and get started here at 8:32 Pacific time. Shout out to my fellow West Coast parents who are rushing in after school drop-off. Good way to get the adrenaline going in the morning. My name is Roddy Theobald. I work in Calder, which is the Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data in Education Research at American Institutes for Research. I'm also the co-chair with Unsu Cho of this year's IESPI meeting. Just want to start by thanking the folks at IES, including Liz Albro and Joan McLaughlin, Jackie Buckley, and Christina Chin for giving me the opportunity to do something really different than my usual day job. So my responsibility today is to introduce and moderate the plenary session for today's conference. In terms of an introduction, to the extent that education issues really ever permeate the national media dialogue, I would reflect back on the pandemic and say there are really two issues that really came to the fore in terms of national media coverage. One was the topic of yesterday's plenary session, which was the outsized impacts of the pandemic on outcomes for public school children. And I thank the plenary presenters yesterday for the excellent discussion around that issue. The issue we'll be talking about today, though, is something that I'd characterize as kind of, over the course of the pandemic, a mushrooming narrative around a teacher profession in crisis. And honestly, for many months of the pandemic, it felt like every single week brought a new story from a new national outlet about, the a mass exodus of teachers and widespread teacher staffing challenges. And that narrative has persisted throughout the pandemic to where we are right now. The framing for today's plenary session is that a frustration that accompanied that was that it proved to be quite difficult to accompany those anecdotal narratives with any hard data on the national teacher workforce. There are, of course, exceptions, as kind of uncommonly good state longitudinal data systems came online from places like Arkansas and Massachusetts, North Carolina, and Washington. We started getting some attrition numbers from the early years of the pandemic. This was accompanied by evidence from RAND's American Education panel around attrition of a sample of teachers nationally. And then, of course, the release of the 2020-21 National Teacher and Principal Survey, which is going to be a big topic of our conversation today, has provided some really important nationally representative estimates around the teacher workforce from the second pandemic year. But from my perspective, the fact remains that at least for long stretches of the pandemic, and certainly in some specific states and districts, it was very difficult to get timely and actionable information on both the extent of staffing challenges in public schools and the distribution of those staffing challenges. So the motivation here is that given the important role that IES has played over its first 20 years in kind of pushing the field and pushing data collection along a number of fronts, I've brought together a set of three experts to kind of grapple with the question for how we can better use and improve data on teachers and staffing challenges in US public schools. So our panelists, you can see on the screen, are from the data research and policy communities, each of whom bring specific expertise and prior work to what I hope is going to be kind of a free-flowing discussion today. No slides, just a discussion. So let me introduce our panelists here. It looks like I'm staring off into space, but now I'm going to look at my notes. Our first panelist is Mara Spiegelman. She's a statistician in the Sample Surveys Division of the National Center for Education Statistics at IES. She's the study director for the National Teacher and Principal Survey, formerly known as the Schools and Staffing Survey, which is a nationally representative data set of teachers and other school staff that provides snapshots of the country K-12 school workforce. So welcome, Mara. Our second panelist is Matthew Kraft, who's an associate professor of education and economics at Brown University. He's a co-author with Josh Bleiberg at the University of Pittsburgh of the article, What Happened to the K-12 Education Labor Market During COVID? The Acute Need for Better Data Systems, which is now published in Education Finance and Policy. Their analysis draws on education employment data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and state education agencies to describe patterns in K-12 education employment and to highlight the limitations of available data. And Matt is joining us from Spain. after school pickup. So we're on opposite ends of the time zone spectrum. Welcome, Matt. And then finally, our last panelist is Patricia Sands-Armstrong, who's a senior economist at the National Council on Teacher Quality, where she leads the research and analysis of state and district education policy and teacher labor market data. She's the author of a December 2022 report titled, "Do States Have the Data They Need to Answer Important Questions About Their Teacher Workforce?" which provides survey data from state education agencies about the extent to which they collect the data they need to answer essential questions about the teacher workforce in their states. Welcome, Patricia. Then finally, a quick housekeeping item. I see at the bottom of my screen that there is both a chat function and a Q&A function. I doubt my multitasking abilities to moderate this discussion and monitor both of those. So I would propose the following. If you have a question that you think would be good for generating discussion among our discussants, please use the Q&A function for that. I will be monitoring that throughout and using my judgment about which questions make sense and how many questions I want to give up, because I really enjoy this specific conversation. If you have quick clarifying questions, I would encourage you to use the chat. We may or may not respond to those, but the chat can kind of serve as a side clarifying conversation if that is useful for anyone attending. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Mara, I'm going to start with you, but I'm going to pose roughly the same question to all of our panelists. The first question is just to speak to the strengths and limitations of existing data on the U.S. public K-12 teacher workforce, of course, speaking from your perspective at the federal level. So I'll turn it over to you, Mara.
Thanks so much. And I might be biased. I think we have a lot of strengths, but I will give my standard disclaimer. Anything I say does not necessarily reflect the position of the department. So for folks who don't spend quite as much of their day as I do inundated in the National Teacher and Principal Survey, NTPS, which I think is probably everybody here, the NTPS is a coordinated set of surveys of public and private schools, principals, and teachers. And it is the department's primary source of information on K-12 education from the perspectives of educators and staff themselves. So in addition to information about teachers' demographics and educational and professional backgrounds, we do collect information that can only be gathered from teachers themselves. So for example, in addition to asking their base teaching salary, we also find out what other jobs teachers might hold during the summer or school year and how much they spend out of pocket on school supplies. We ask about their perceptions of school climate, autonomy, influence over school policies, and how supported they feel. We do ask about their career intentions, and one study that everybody loves is in select years, we do follow up with a longitudinal component 1 year later to measure actual attrition. So not just what do they expect to do 1 year from them, but what are they doing now 1 year later? Are they working at the same school? Have they moved to a different school? Have they left the profession, and why did they make those choices? So as Roddy noted, the NTPS was previously known as the Schools and Staffing Survey, and these studies together have been conducted since 1987. So that's over 35 years of trend data, which again, we all love. And the periodicity of the studies has varied a little bit over the years, but we're on a 3-year schedule right now or so. So our most recent collection was in the 2020 to 2021 school year, and we're preparing for another data collection that will start this fall. So the NTPS is a very large study. Our most recent collection sampled about 10,000 public schools and 68,000 of their teachers. That was, of course, a challenging collection for us. It was a very challenging time for everyone, and educators quite reasonably were focusing on educating students in a pandemic, not necessarily completing a survey for the federal government. But we did maintain high response rates for us. That was in the upper 60s for public school principals and schools, and about 62% for sampled teachers. So because of that study design, the sample size, the response rates, the NTPS is representative of all public schools, all private schools, and staff in those schools. You can look at estimates by different school characteristics, traditional public versus public charter, whether a school is in a rural, suburban, or urban area. For the public data, you can also look at estimates by state. Who doesn't love a good comparison between your neighbors? And based on the size and the design, It also supports estimates for different subgroups of teacher characteristics. So you can look at a snapshot or trends for teachers with different race ethnicities or main teaching assignments or trends for first-year teachers. And I noted that our most recent collection was in 2020 to 2021, right in the heart of the COVID pandemic. So the data from that can be used to look at that year to previous cycles, which it turned out to be really nice for us to have that sort of mid-pandemic, pre-pandemic comparison. We have some of those on our website. There's a lot left to do, hopefully for you all to do. And one thing we did for that collection was we added a new item that was at the time you're completing the survey, how was your school operating or how are you teaching? Is it hybrid, in person, or remote? That does not give national estimates of how schools were operating at that time because teachers filled this out at different times of the year and that wasn't random, but it helps put their responses into context. So if somebody's talking about how many hours they work in a week, well, how are they teaching at that time? Is it in person? Is it remote? So we think that that's really exciting to look at as well. So the data meet NCS statistical standards. They go through extensive processing and QC procedures, logic checks for consistency, imputation for missing data, weighting in order to meet those standards. And we make this all available to researchers in a few different ways. We have reports that we put out on our website, tables for folks who like that. We do that as quickly as we can. But of course, we can't look at everything. We have a lot of data. So we have a few different tools so folks can do analysis on their own. We have a public-facing data tool known as Data Lab. So anyone can go in, look at frequencies, crosstabs, regressions, certain types of things. We also do, of course, have microdata files for anybody who really wants to dig in, play with the data, do some more advanced analyses. So in order to meet all of our confidentiality and privacy standards, you do need a restricted license to do those, but we do strongly encourage that for people who are interested. So that's my introduction for now.
Great, thank you so much, Mara. And I'm sure I'm not the only IESPI on the call amazed by your high 60s response rate in the heart of the pandemic. So thanks for setting that standard for all of us. Let's turn to Matt next, speaking to your paper with Josh on particularly the BLS data.
Thanks so much, Roddy. Pleasure to be here with everyone virtually today. I want to just start by saying that the theme of today's conversation is kind of focused on the data that exists and the data that don't exist and that we wish did. But we should take a step back and remember that we are actually quite privileged as education researchers that focus on the context of the US. We have a very rich general landscape with which to study these questions. And so while we would like more, of course, within context, I think we should not neglect to recognize the kind of richness of the data that we currently have access to. But the reason why I think this panel was organized was because the questions we tried to answer during the pandemic that were fundamental to trying to support the teacher workforce and support students to navigate the pandemic's effect were questions that we could not fundamentally answer in a timely way. And those questions were as large as macro questions around, are teachers leaving the profession? And if so, to what degree? And questions that were much more focused on a micro level. And there's a strong body of research that shows that we have to have those micro data because teaching and researching and studying about the teacher labor market is really a misnomer because it is a huge conglomerate of micro markets, both in the geographic sense, because teacher employment preferences are hyper localized, and in the sense that teachers are a conglomerate of professionals who have licenses and degrees and training in specific subject areas in instructional pedagogies. And so it's a collection of this set of professionals with hyper-localized preferences. And so we really want to be able to understand not only the macro trends, but where to zoom in to find both bright spots and address acute challenges. When my co-author, Josh Bleiberg, and I set out to try to do that at the onset of the pandemic, we learned about what was available at the federal level, largely collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And what I'll highlight here is the kind of macro takeaways from that. And I've provided a link to the paper in the chat if you'd like to read more about the details. But the spirit of that is that there are these available federal data sets, the current employment survey, the quarterly census of employment and wages, and the job openings and labor turnover survey, which capture macro patterns in employment in the K-12 ed sector, or sometimes K-16 and beyond ed sector. But and they're timely. We can track things in a sometimes monthly or quarterly basis. But what they don't allow us to do is to hone in on even, for example, K-12 public teachers. And so it's not as useful as we would want when we're trying to not only understand what's happening in K-12 public schools, let alone to try to understand if there's any differences for other types of employees. So there's just this kind of agglomeration of K-12 employees that includes bus drivers and school principals and other professionals working in school settings. Some of them include post-secondary, such as the JOLT. Some of them include private schools, such as the QCEW. And so you have these kind of different samples. And so when you're talking about teachers, you're often using a term that is a little less precise than we would want when we're applying the most fine-grained measures in these contexts. So what's the alternative? Well, the current population survey, the CPS, does allow for a more fine-grained occupational level analysis. And so that is, I think, encouraging, but particularly during the pandemic, the nature of that data collection produced some challenges, not only due to changing response rates in the wake of the pandemic, due to getting people on the phone, as well as simply the wording of questions about whether a teacher had worked in the past week when we're experiencing a kind of unprecedented upheaval of what it means to work as a teacher in that transition and hybrid pandemic experience. And so that, combined with the fact that the CPS isn't really designed in terms of its sample design nor powered to give us super precise monthly measures of fine-grained employment categories such as, cafeteria workers or special education teachers. So it's hard to get the precision we're looking for, although it gets us a step in that direction. The other federal data set that education researchers often go to, the Common Core of Data, provides FTE counts of employees in K-12 public schools, which is useful, but the limitation there is that they often are reported with over a year lag. And so not only is that limiting in terms of being responsive in a short-term time frame, but also they don't allow us to understand whether those employees are the same ones over time. And so any degree of turnover and replacement is really masked by those aggregate numbers. And so, the spirit, I think, of this conversation is to say, okay, we have these things. They help us to get little windows, kind of black and white images of what may be happening, but we need a, full technicolor, immediate vision of what's happening. So what is it going to take to get there?
Thanks so much, Matt. And then Patricia, I'm hoping you can speak to the same question as well, building on your work, looking at state longitudinal data systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Roddy, and everyone for having me here. I don't know how familiar you are with the work of NCDQ, but I think NCDQ is more known for their work with teacher preparation programs, but we do have a big body of work that focuses on teacher policies, and that's where I come in. I tend to follow the teacher workforce a lot. About every couple of years, about every 2 years, NCDQ for a long time, I think since 2011 or so, we have put out a report that looks into what teacher supply and demand and teacher shortages data states produce and publish. And so, when the pandemic hit and the conversations about teacher shortages became more prevalent, and some headlines that were kind of scary in the media, my honest question was, how do they know? And it was not like, no, they're not. I was not denying that there were staffing challenges, but it was a genuine question of how do they know? Because as far as we could tell, we've been following this for a decade, states did not really publish the data necessary to ascertain whether they were dealing with staffing challenges. My latest report on that was in 2021, and I found that I think it was only 2 states that reported out of the 50 plus DC that reported data sufficiently disaggregated of supply and demand to connect it into shortages that were meaningfully disaggregated, right? I know that states do provide a list of shortage areas every year, but that's a list, right? Of this is where we're having challenges versus actual data that could inform with granularity these shortages. So because we found that that severe limitation, we were wondering, well, maybe states do collect the data, but they just don't make it public. So shortly after that, and let me actually put it in the chat for all of you to peruse if you would like to. Shortly after that, we decided let's survey the states, and we I think it was June, July last year. We sent a survey to all of the states asking about 43 data points on supply and demand and shortages, going from from demographics of the teacher workforce to where they're prepared, how many do you have, turnover, etc. You name it. And 44 states responded to our survey, and the report that I just put in the chat is just a short report summarizing our findings. So you asked about strengths and limitations. So let's start with strengths a little bit, right? And let me tell you what we found. We found that states have a lot more data than what they publish, and that's great. They have data. So 44 states responded to our survey, and on average, they had close to 60% of all the data points that we inquired about. That's great. As Matt was saying, let's not take that for granted. We work in data, and 60% of all the points that could possibly inform, about the teacher workforce and shortages, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. And again, we asked about 43 data points. About each data point, we asked 3 questions. We asked, do you have it? How disaggregated do you have it? As in, do you have it at the state level, at the district level, at the school level? And how current do you have it? So that's the other piece of good news. We've heard about lags in data, and that is true in published data, but of the data points that the states said they had, over 90% was current. So that's also huge good news. What were the limitations that we found? We found that, so I told you that we asked about, do you have the data point, do you have it disaggregated, and how current do you have it? The disaggregation was a little bit of a problem. states tend to have data aggregated at the state level, but not, or at the district level. Not many have it at the school level, for example. Or for example, when we're talking about teacher preparation, not many states had information at the program level. They might have it at the institution level or at the state level. And those disaggregations are going to be important because that it gets to the heart of equity, for example, right? That's where we see the distribution of supply, the distribution of demand, which students are being served by whom. If we want to get to that type of questions, we need that type of disaggregation. And let me just back up a little bit when it comes to, you know, I'm talking about questions right now. I think as researchers, we know that the data is not about the data, but it's about the questions that we can answer with that data, right? And so it all comes back to a question, right? If you want to know whether all students have access to effective teachers, then you're talking about real kids and real teachers, and you are asking a very pertinent question. The data and the disaggregation of that data is going to help you inform that. So again, challenges or limitations, one of the things was lack of disaggregated data. Another challenge that that we were able to identify with that survey was that state systems, and this is going to be a duh, right? But state systems follow people. They know what they have. They don't know what they don't have. So in other words, they don't know much about their vacancies, right? Because their systems follow people. So they can tell you a lot about their teacher workforce. They cannot tell you much about what they're missing because their systems are not following that. And I understand some of the challenges of following something non-existent, right? But so hopefully, in the next part of the conversation, we can get a little bit into that. But so that was another challenge that I identified. And then another challenge that I identified was lack of connections, and not only in this survey, but for example, I think it was like a couple of years ago, there was a report on the state of the state's longitudinal data systems. And I was able to find also like a lack of connections there. It seems like it's great that the states have developed data systems that inform and follow students. The data systems that follow and inform teachers are a little bit less developed, but they don't seem to talk to one another too much. So there's that lack of connections. And just one more challenge to wrap it up. And I think that this is something that we are a country that is based on a federalized system, right? So states have certain degree of independence. In April 2022, we also put out a report examining what data states make publicly available, detailing if students of color and students living in poverty have equitable access to experience in field and effective teachers. And when we went to look for that data, we found so many different definitions of experience in field and effective, almost as many as there are states. Okay, I'm exaggerating, but there were a lot of different definitions. And so it was pretty hard to have a comprehensive, a national view of those challenges when the states did not really align on their definitions. So I'm gonna leave it there because I know there's more coming.
Thank you so much, Patricia, and thanks to all three of you for setting the stage so nicely for the next stage of the conversation. For those of you attending, this is a great time to start sending in questions through the QA. I see one of them. I'm gonna ask one more question to generate the next part of the conversation, then turn to the QA for follow-up questions after that. My next question I'm going to ask a little bit differently to each of the panelists. It's about suggestions and next steps. And Mara, I'm hoping you can start by telling us a little bit, as the project director for the National Teacher and Principal Survey, tell us a little bit about the next steps that are planned on that survey and what you're looking to change about the survey moving forward.
Sure. So I come at this from sort of the wonky data collection perspective. That's my background. And I know folks already have talked about teacher attrition data and challenges in disaggregating that and getting comparisons. So we do have the teacher follow-up survey, which is that 1-year longitudinal follow-up to the NTPS. So that can measure for us, the most recent one is attrition from the 2020 to 2021 school year to the 21-22 school year. Sorry, these years are very hard to say in a slow way. It's not a great, time in our period to do that. So that should be coming out later this year. We're really excited about that. There was a fairly large gap for us in when that was last released. We had about a 9-year lag because of challenges in response rates. We couldn't get enough power to have statistical precision for some of those intermediary years. So that's why it was on a bit of a break. And that's certainly a challenge that we have to focus on for data collection. We need to maintain those high response rates. So that matters both for the base NTPS and for those follow-up studies. So we do try to make the response process as easy as possible for principals and teachers, try to show them why we think this matters. I know most folks aren't sitting around in their day jobs just waiting to complete federal surveys, and Matt noted that, yes, this is a problem not just for us. This really is a problem for everyone and the federal government and without, so people can respond through different modes. We've done some experimental work recently that I'm really excited about for those follow-up surveys where we can reach out to principals and teachers by text message if that's the mode that they prefer. So sending them links to questionnaires, or in some cases actually texting questions back and forth, where we're finding some really promising results for that. And also just trying to show them why this data matters. So somebody gets a questionnaire, they fill it out, they feel maybe like it goes into a vacuum or if it's on someone's shelf. So we do a good job at putting out technical reports, but that's not necessarily helpful for a respondent. So we're working on some other data products to try to show why we think this matters, how the data are used by not just researchers, but members of the media, by policymakers. We have a dashboard where folks can look at sort of infographic type settings and type visuals and see how their state compares to other states. We have some physical products that do that as well. For that teacher follow-up study, because we know a lot about these teachers, they already completed the NTPS. We sent them back some infographics. So, we're asking you to complete this follow-up study. We know you're a math teacher. Here's some stats about math teachers that we know because of teachers like you. So here's the average salary. Here's how many of you have outside jobs, second jobs that you have to work. Here's how much you make from them, to try to really show why this is important to us and why we think that is important to you as well. So we are trying to get that out there. And burden is also certainly a big concern. We all want data. We all want data for different purposes. And there are a lot of people competing for time amongst, again, principals and teachers and school staff who have full day jobs on top of all of this. So we do try to think about that with our questionnaires. So for example, we integrate some items from the CCD, from EdFacts, so we don't have to repeat them, but many states have this data from different sources. It's not standardized, so we can't fully eliminate redundancy for all individuals, but we do try to append that where possible. Our questionnaires are on the long side. We do rotate content where we can, so we're not asking every single question in our bank of items every single cycle, so we can be a little bit shorter for folks. We've looked into ways to make our teacher rosters more streamlined. We have to create our own teacher frame. There's no national list of all teachers. That's really important for us to get data that's representative of all teachers. We need to create that frame. So we've streamlined the process and made it a bit easier for schools to provide that information. So that's a lot of sort of the background stuff that we're working on to hopefully make the data more salient, have it disseminated more, and really increase the usefulness, especially for respondents.
Thank you so much, Mara. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's extremely excited in the wonkiest way possible for the teacher follow-up survey later this year. That's really exciting news. I'm going to phrase the question a little bit differently for Matt and Patricia. I'll invite you to go first, Matt. My question that I posed is whether you have, 1 to 3 specific proposals for us to consider for improving existing data on the U.S. teacher workforce.
Great. I've got 3 for us today. Number 1, it's, I think, simple, but it would be extremely useful. Let's all think back to 15 years ago when we were struggling as a country and across states talking about high school graduation, to just align on what a measure of high school graduation rates was. Because although a single statistic like that would appear quite simple, it turns out that you could have very reasonable but quite disparate approaches in measuring that. Ultimately, although I think people have different preferences, the federal government and IES with their Common Core of Data kind of stepped into that void to say, hey, we're going to try to unify that with a definition of a 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate. And that helped to standardize an approach to calculations. Whether that's the right or wrong one, we can debate, but at least we have apples to apples. We don't have anything close to apples to apples. We have apples to kiwi, to grapefruit, to jackfruit, to durian across states and even within states across districts because of, as Patricia mentioned, our decentralized education system. And so we need just a basic common definition of teacher turnover. Is it teachers leaving their school or leaving a district or a state workforce? Is it teachers leaving as a classroom teacher or leaving as an employee of a public K-12 system? Is it, when you say teacher turnover for 2021, does that mean the teachers who left from the prior year or the teachers who were working that year that left the next year? How do we deal with teachers who we know take a temporary leave but will return the following year? All of these things actually have incredibly impactful consequences for the calculation of teacher turnover. And our efforts to just try to do a quick and dirty state level public data comparison were really, really hampered by a lack of alignment between basic definitions. So we need a common definition. I think the second thing that the federal government and IES could do is to, in the same way that they leveraged both incentives and data collection requirements for states to build statewide longitudinal data systems, they could do the same to catalyze efforts for those states who are not in the vanguard of having a statewide unified database that NCTQ has kind of tried to survey and get a better sense of, with grants to in capacity building, so that those types of data systems come online and are available in a unified way. And why would we want that to happen? Because recommendation number 3 is that I think the likely intuitive place to start to aggregate this information is within the Common Core of Data for basic common definitions across states, which already the infrastructure exists. States are reporting a whole host of information. If we can support them to get a teacher labor market data set to complement the student longitudinal data systems, then we can start to record basic information about turnover and leaving that would be critical for informing timely policy questions. Now, we want more than that, but I think we have to start with a tangible goal, and that's common definition, incentive and capacity building for states to be able to calculate those statistics, and the federal government's role to compile them in a usable data set, the Common Core of Data.
Thank you, Matt. I chuckled to myself when I read out loud my question of 1 to 3. Who's going to offer 1 or 2, right? So thank you for those 3 suggestions. That is awesome. Patricia, can I pose the same question to you, please?
Yes, but I'm going to cheat because I have like 7. But so and I'm plus wanting those that Matt just said, so it's like I have like 10. No, but there are some big ones, but I also want to offer some like really concrete examples of some small suggestions that maybe some states can leverage. So I want to like definitely plus one the use of longitudinal data systems, but I wanted to make an emphasis on connections. You know, I was mentioning that in my research, I found that systems don't talk to each other that much, are lacking connections. Massachusetts did something really cool recently. They have something called the Learning Experience Report, where they are able to look at their students and see, because they have a connection between students and teachers, they are able to see what's each student's exposure to different types of teachers. So for example, you know that little Jimmy here has been having novice teachers for over like 2 years in a row. So maybe, you know, the administration of the school can make an effort to put little Jimmy in, you know, in a teacher with not a novice school the next year, right? But you cannot get to that without that type of connections between students and teachers, and you need the granular connection. You need the one-on-one. So just plus one to the leveraging longitudinal data systems, but focus on connections. Connections also important in between not just between teachers and students, but also teachers and teacher prep programs. I really love what Texas has been doing recently. They have this amazing dashboards where you can see their new hires and where they're coming from. And that's it. They're beautiful. Kudos, props to the TA people who are doing this. They allow you to identify, for example, you know, it's like teachers coming from X tend to have higher turnover, or teachers coming from this prep program tend to be more effective. And, you know, there's some accountability that can happen when you know, and not just that, but feedback and improvement that can happen when you have those connections. So leverage these data systems, you know, try to connect them. And sometimes it is as simple as coming up and okay, I'm not the one developing those data systems, so I'm going to say simple, you know, from my point of view, but I know that there's much more to that. But what I was going to say is that sometimes all it takes is having a unique identifier, developing a unique identifier that follows the individual through all those stages. You know, sometimes the data is already there, that you just need to connect it via a unique identifier. So if that's the case, low-hanging fruit, leverage that. The other thing, it's like you don't have to do it on your own. I think that states have a great power to centralize this information, but I would recommend just leverage partnerships. I know that I'm not supposed to have favorites, but I do. Colorado is my favorite. Okay, they have so much data, and not just so much data, but they have it public in these beautiful dashboards and maps that really can inform a lot of what's going on with their teacher workforce. They didn't do it on their own. They partnered with their regional educational laboratory, their REL center, and because they did not have the capacity to develop those maps on their own, you know, so they partnered with someone. In some cases, you know, we know that states have partnered with researchers like us to be able to develop some measures or some forecasts. So seek those partnerships. I think that will be another big recommendation. Big recommendation, and I know that there's a lot of caveats here. Consider making your data publicly available in a way that is digestible by the public. It's not just important to inform, you know, your department's own policies and practices, and, you know, share it nicely your data with us researchers to study, a question that you're interested in. But I think that we have seen the importance of informing the public discourse, including what comes out in the media, which can sway national policy. And then you find as researchers, like what happened, during the pandemic with shortages. We had these headlines, screaming about teacher shortages, and then you found several of us just scrambling to figure out, okay, where's this data coming from? Who has data? How can we put something out that is actually informed in a meaningful way? If your state has that data and makes it publicly available in a way that's tractable and digestible, we might not find ourselves in that pinch. Another favorite that I'm not supposed to have, I want to point to Indiana. And this is a very practical recommendation. Consider a statewide teacher job. I think that one is also low-hanging fruit, and it not only to help direct resources to places, we were talking about how the teacher labor market is hyper-localized. And I have always wondered how much of that hyper-localization has to do with lack of information, right? I mean, how do you know if your neighboring district is experiencing some specific staffing challenges? So I think that a statewide job board could help channel teacher resource to places where they're struggling, but also it's a great way to collect data on vacancies. So again, look to Indiana. Indiana started a job board, it started voluntary, and now I think that the participation has increased. So I can just look at those examples if you're interested in that. And so speaking of vacancies, I mentioned it before. I know that it is really hard to develop a data system that follows something that is non-existent, like what you don't have, which is, teachers' vacancies. And again, look at Colorado. Colorado, what they did, instead of making it part of the data system, they sent each year a survey to their districts. So, they found a way around it, and they just surveyed their districts every year and asked them, where are your vacancies, school by school and subject area by subject area in a meaningful, disaggregated way. So they have a great dashboard and report on vacancies. So a survey can be a great workaround to not being able to count the non-existent. And finally, the suggestion is to maybe try to forecast. And I think that comes after, right? I mean, once your data system has been established, we know that we're always looking back and reacting to teacher staffing challenges. And I think that it will be great for states to be able to look forward a little bit and be a little bit more proactive when it comes to their staffing challenges. I don't know if those were 7, but I know it was more than 3, but thank you for the time.
Thank you, Patricia. So I'd like to use our last 25 minutes together in the following way. Mara, Matt, Patricia, if you want to use, I'm going to keep going in this order. If you want to use your time to react to anything that another panelist has said, that would be a good use of time. But I'm also going to start going through the question and answers, the questions that you can see on your screen. Mara, you can see the one that I'm about to pose. Hopefully that's giving you time to think about it, because I don't like being surprised. Let me just tell you, Matt, I'm going to pose you the question from Chris Doss, and Patricia, I'm going to pose the question from Ralph Ferretti, and then we can go from there, just so one person's responding to each question. Mara, I'm going to read this out loud because I think our attendees can't see the Q&A.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I just want to keep promoting the teacher follow-up survey.
Yeah.
We are very precise in our definitions of what we mean by a teacher, of when we're measuring attrition, of what they're doing now, not just you moved, are you still a teacher? What are you doing in the school? But if we know somebody moved, did you move to another school in the same district? Did you move to a different district? Did you move to a private school? So we do have, I think, a lot of that disaggregation that you want, and hopefully you can be patient as we do that. And of course, the information on why did you make these decisions, or what is your precise job now, or if you move to a different area, where is that? That's the information that is not necessarily available through those data systems, since tracking teachers out of state can be tricky. Are they going to give you that information on why did they leave, or what specifically were they unhappy about? So I'm just going to keep plugging that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mara. So I'm going to read this first question. This is from Fiona Hollins. This is very relevant to our current conference, given the focus at IES on cost analyses. So all IESPIs, listen up, because this is a great question. So the question is, Mara, we recommend NTPS, the National Teacher and Principal Survey, as a source of salary data for cost analyses. However, it isn't totally clear what positions are included. For example, in the principal surveys, do you include assistant principals? If so, is it possible to break them out? Do teachers include special education teachers? If so, can they be broken out? And then for both sets of data, can you say how many days or hours of work time the salaries cover, and whether there's available data on other school staff? That's several questions. I'll let you respond to what makes sense for you.
So the answer to most of them is yes. And I will also say, it's really, really easy to find my contact information online. If anybody wants to follow up with these specifically, it can be actually a little bit too easy in some cases, but we do have extensive documentation. If you don't want to wade through that, please reach out. So the principal surveys do not have APs. It is only people whose title is principal or school head at that time. But I think the answer to everything else here is yes. So we do ask about teachers' main assignments, details about all the classes they teach. So yes, you can absolutely look at differences by whether somebody's primary assignment is special education, whether they teach any special education. For both sets of data, yes, we ask about contract time, certainly for both teachers and principals. And we do also have data on how many hours they say they actually work. So what is it on paper, and how much is it that they actually do work? So you can look at that both ways. And for teachers, we have many detailed questions about other salary supplements that they have through their school, through their district. Are they earning money in the summer? Are they earning money during the school year, to get that full picture? We do not have separate surveys on other types of school staff, just because of the scope of this. Teachers and principals alone keeps us fairly busy at the moment. We do have staff counts of a number of different positions, but we don't have separate follow-up studies to look at, for example, aides or other positions at this time. I think I got
so much, Mara. You did, and I will attest to your responsiveness to questions. You've responded to many of my questions over the years, and it was not hard to find your contact info for this plenary session. So thank you. Matt, two-pronged, any reactions you have, but also I'm going to read this question from Chris Doss at RAND. What do you think a realistic teacher data system that comes as close to the ideal possible, which I assume is a national level micro data set, what do you think that looks like?
I'll start with that and then add another comment more broadly. I think we can get a reasonable sense about what we would want from thinking about some of the more advanced state level teacher data sets. Now, realistically, do I think we are going to get to a place where we have a data set that connects with a unique ID all almost 4 million educators in the US? No. What do I think is realistic? I think that if we got 50 states in the District of Columbia to have rich state level longitudinal teacher labor market data that researchers could work with in research practitioner partnerships like the ones that, Roddy, you're part of in Washington State, and Olivia Chi and Andrew Bacher-Hicks in Massachusetts, and Hema Zamaro and her colleagues in Arkansas that, are putting out these updates in a timely way, that if we had that in a more, higher coverage existence, then we would be in a much better place. And I think that's realistic. I also think that it's realistic to take those 50 data sets and have a set of common aggregate statistics and counts that we do unify in a single national data set that could be even at the school level or the district level, let alone the state level. And so I think both of those things would be huge step forwards. the kind of barrier to the ideal, I think, is that it just doesn't seem realistic that states are going to coordinate to have a common ID that tracks individual teachers across borders. We can't even recognize licensures yet across borders in a lot of contexts. So we have a long way to go to kind of reduce that labor market mobility, let alone tracking. But I think those are the right directions to head. And the more, macro comment I'll add is that much like the schools and staffing survey, now the, NCPS is, these are data sets that aren't just things we want. They are catalysts for research and investment in one of the core sectors of our economy and one of the core features and institutions in our society, a pillar of building a nation and democratic ideals and civic values. And so if we take a step back, we need to just recognize that we're not just saying we want some numbers because we want to be able to count things. No, we want to invest in this so that we can build and support an education system that students deserve. And part of that, certainly by no means all of it, but part of it is just being able to understand what is happening, because teachers ultimately are at the core of that work. And we need to understand what they're telling us based on their actual actions.
Thanks so much, Matt. Patricia, I'm going to turn to the next question. I hope this is okay, Ralph. I'm going to ask kind of a preliminary question in the middle here, which is focused on data, but let me read the question. So the question is, despite the state level variation in definitions, evaluative standards, and analytic techniques, there's consensus about the nationwide challenges of attracting and retaining certified teachers. Increasingly, states are establishing non-degree apprenticeship programs to fill the void. The interim question I'm going to pose in there, Patricia, is that something you know from your data collection, whether states are collecting data on? I don't remember it from your report, but I'd love for you to speak to that. And also, if you want to speak to the last question here about the likelihood of this strategy's success and how you think it will affect the quality of instruction and student outcomes, that would be very helpful too. Thank you.
Yes, I'll be happy to actually address both. I know that the last part of the question veers off a little bit of the data point, but I still want to address it and ground it back to data. But to answer your question, Roddy, or your interim question, we actually did ask states whether they had information on like non-traditional certification routes. And I think that we probably have seen this even with the Department of Education data. That is the less prevalent data that they have. States tend to have data on their traditional programs, a whole lot more, or on their non-traditional programs that are based at a university, but not so much on the non-traditional programs that are not based at a university or higher education institution. So that there's a lot less data on that, which is what I want to bring back to answer this last part of the questions. I love the idea that these apprenticeship programs are happening, right? And I'm going to say that as a general statement. As an economist, I need to say it depends, right? Because there's always nuance, there's always high variability, and it depends on how it's implemented, right? It depends on what their characteristics are. But what we're seeing is that they leverage their own population, which is huge because we have a demographic mismatch between teachers and students. And I think that these apprenticeship programs really help to feel like to narrow that gap a little more, of the demographic mismatch, and just to pull into teaching people who are already invested in the community, who already live in the community. So I think that is great. The other great thing about apprenticeship programs is the apprenticeship itself, right? It's I think that student teaching, or the mentoring part of becoming a teacher, and the mentoring in the early career, early years of a teaching career are critical. And I think a lot of these apprenticeship programs do provide that. So I think that those are really great points in favor of apprenticeship programs. But bringing it back to the data, I think that is one of the risks. You know, there isn't much data. There isn't much data following these teachers, and I'm thinking I saw a meme somewhere on Twitter a while ago that said that how we in the education field, you know, like as a pendulum, at some point we were like, it's all about the inputs, it's all about the outputs, and yes, it's but it's about both, right? And so I think that it is important to, again, going back to my plug for linking data, it's really important to follow these teachers, and not just to follow them, but also to know what type of impact they're having. Without this data, we are not really going to be able to assess their success, right? So I think that it's if they're implemented right, I think they're great. I think that they have some characteristics that could work really well, but we need to follow them. We need to follow them with data. Again, not just because of the numbers, but as Matt was saying, and as I was saying earlier, this is about real people. This is about answering real questions.
Thanks so much. We have 2 more questions in the queue, and I think that I'm going to pose this next question to both Mara and Matt to address from whatever perspective makes sense given your expertise in prior work. And then, Patricia, I'm going to pose the last one to you, just so you can think ahead. And then I think that'll probably take us to time. The question for Mara and Matt is from Ken Frank. The question is, what is the potential to link federal data to state data and state data to local data gathered by a district or independent researchers or organizations like NWEA? What are the challenges and can they be overcome? Mara, can I ask you to speak to that first?
Yes. So with the microdata files, we have NCES school IDs. So if your outside data source has that, which I think many of them will, especially at the state level, you can absolutely do that, and people have. Certainly, if you don't have this for all types of schools or certain types of districts, that becomes a challenge. But people do this all the time, and please do. So that's through the restricted use licenses. This is not possible with teachers. For teachers, we don't provide anything that can identify them to tie them from school to school, but certainly you have the information about their school or their geographic area.
Thanks, Mara. And Matt, do you want to speak to this as well?
Yes. So one of the things that isn't present in most state level data sets or federal data sets is rich information on teacher working conditions. And if we're trying to understand teacher labor markets, I would argue that is a fundamentally critical feature of teachers' working experiences to capture. Now, luckily, Mara and her colleagues have some really nice questions that capture elements of that, but they have to be judicious about how many questions they can ask of folks. And so many districts have now started to add their own kind of boutique working conditions surveys as part of their own data collection. And the degree that we could take in a way that was easier, because most often districts will report school aggregate measures on those publicly, but they don't make it easy to aggregate and download that data, nor do they provide the convenient, IES school IDs with which we would like to have to link to the kind of larger existing infrastructure on school data. So I think that's a hugely important kind of next step about taking these state and district level data sets and supplementing it with a working conditions measures. I'll also briefly flag an answer that I added in the chat to a really good question from Lindsay Matsumura, which was, what do we know about the pre-K early childhood educator labor market? I think the first thing we know is that it's frankly broken in the United States. But the second thing is that if you want for more information on statistics about turnover, it's hard to get that at a national level because a lot of this sector is in the private market. But Daphna Basak and her colleagues, I think, have done some really nice work, and I at least referenced one paper of theirs in the chat. So do check that out.
Thanks so much, Matt. And then Patricia, the last question from the Q&A I think we have time for is from Joni Lakin. I'm in academia and in a state that doesn't have the political will for longitudinal centralized data. What collaborations or strategies might be effective?
I actually love that question because it lets me plug in a little bit of my work, and not just my work, but like everyone here. I think that research practice partnerships can be very powerful, very important, not just for analyzing topics, researching topics, but also to help with the development of data systems. I know that there's been some work partnering with independent researchers to for example, develop forecasting system for teacher shortages. That's an important partnership. I suggest, for example, reaching out to Gemma Samaro. I know that researchers at University of Arkansas have been partnering with the State Department to precisely do that, to precisely help them develop data systems and to be their capacity to analyze teacher workforce data. And so they're working closely with the states, as far as I know. But I don't have all the information to talk about that, but if you're interested in that, I suggest reaching out to her. She's awesome, super friendly. So I think that that's an important partnership. But again, to plugging in my work, this is also something that NCTQ is trying to do. After we put out that survey, asking the states, well, what data do you have, whether it's publicly available or not, that report that I put into chat, then we actually gave each state a personalized profile saying, okay, here are 15, 20, I don't remember how many there were, like of the main questions that you might want to answer about your data, your teacher workforce. And these are the data points that you should have if you want to answer those questions, that you're going to need if you want to answer those questions. And it was like, do you have this or not? And the next step is reaching out to them and providing some consultancies or technical assistance to figure out what they have, what they don't have, and maybe help them establish connections with people or with states who have developed those systems, so that they can do that themselves. With some states, we're also partnering to do what I was saying that Gemma Samaro and colleagues were doing, to be their capacity. So we're partnering with a few states and piloting this program where we will hopefully receive some of their data and process that data and help them create measures of teacher shortages and help them also forecast measures of teacher shortages. We're a small institution, so we can only deal with a few selected states, but that's why it's like leverage that relationship, those connections between academia and the states, those partnerships. And again, we from the nonprofit sector will do what we can to help them guide to what are their voids, which state has filled those voids and how they did it, and maybe help establish those connections and maybe help them be that capacity when we can and when they don't have it.
Thanks so much. I'm going to sneak in one more question, and I'm going to finish with you, Mara. It's actually the follow-up question I suggested earlier, which is that so much of what we know about the teacher workforce comes from the Schools and Staffing Survey and prior iteration of the National Teacher and Principal Survey. And I think that particularly within the special education research community, I'm thinking of the work of Liz Bettini, Ali Gilmore, Lucky Mason-Williams, and others. There's been terrific use of the most recent wave of NTPS before this, with the recent release of the latest wave of the National Teacher Principal Survey and the coming release of the Teacher Follow-Up Survey. Is there anything we can be doing as a research community to get the word out about this source of data on teachers and principals and push research forward?
using our data helps a lot with visibility. You know, tell all your friends, people do secondary analysis, or even just use it as a reference point. Since again, I mean, I am here to self-promote. We think this is really valuable. This is filling in some of the gaps that you all have talked about. You know, we're still waiting for it. We're all looking forward to this fall. But I think it can answer so many of the questions that you all have talked about today. So yes, use our data.
And I think that I will end it there. I really appreciate all of our panelists. This is a weird Zoom environment. I'm going to clap out loud on mine. You can feel free to clap wherever you are to thank our panelists. I've been asked by the organizers to suggest that you go back to the session agenda and rate this session so we can get feedback on this plenary session. But again, thank you so much to our panelists. I hope that you enjoy the rest of the ISPI meeting. Please reach out with any questions about the rest of the meeting, and thank you again for attending.